I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, straightening my tie, when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a Saturday morning in late May, and the graduation party was set to start at 2 o'clock. I had already wrapped the gift, a leather-bound journal, and a check for $500 tucked inside, and placed it on the kitchen table next to my car keys. The sun was coming through the window, and I was feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. I was feeling genuinely happy. I picked up the phone and saw my son's name on the screen. I answered without thinking twice. "Hey," he said. His voice had a flatness to it that I recognized, but chose not to dwell on. "I need to talk to you about today." "I'm almost ready," I said. "I was thinking I'd head over around 1:30 so I can help set up if you need." "That's actually what I'm calling about." He paused. "Vivian and I talked last night. We think it's better if you don't come today." I stopped straightening my tie. "What do you mean, don't come?" "Her parents are flying in from Phoenix. Her whole side of the family is going to be there. Her brother, her cousins. You know how it gets when there's a mix of people. It just gets complicated." I stood there looking at my own reflection, and for a moment I didn't say anything at all. My grandson Jake was turning 18 and graduating with honors. I had driven him to school on his first day of kindergarten. I had sat with him in the emergency room when he broke his wrist in 7th grade. I had helped him build a Pinewood Derby car when he was 9 years old, and we had stayed up until midnight sanding it down together. And now I was being told that my presence at his graduation party would make things complicated. "Does Jake know about this?" I asked. "Jake is fine with it. Look, it's not a big deal. We'll do something separate with you. Dinner next week, maybe?" "Dinner next week," I repeated. "Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I almost said something. There were about 40 different things I wanted to say right then, and none of them were particularly calm or measured. But instead I heard myself say I understood, and I told him I'd talk to him later, and I ended the call. I put the phone down on the counter and looked at the gift sitting on the kitchen table. The wrapping paper had little gold graduation caps printed on it. I had spent 20 minutes at the store picking it out. I sat down in the chair by the window, and I didn't move for a long time. Let me tell you something about the years that led up to that phone call, because that call did not come out of nowhere. Nothing like that ever does. My name is Raymond. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer, and I retired at 62 with a paid-off house, a solid savings account, and what I thought was a good relationship with my son, Marcus, and his family. His wife, Vivian, had never been especially warm with me, but I had always chalked that up to personality differences. She was sharp-edged in the way some people are, quick to find fault, slow to offer gratitude. I had made my peace with that a long time ago. What I had not made my peace with, and what I had been making excuses for over the years, was the pattern. It started small, the way these things always do. About 8 years before that phone call, Marcus and Vivienne were struggling. He had just changed jobs, and the new salary hadn't kicked in yet, and she had stopped working when their second child was born. They needed help with one mortgage payment. "Just one," Marcus said, "just to get through the month." I helped. Of course I helped. He was my son. But 1 month became 3 months. And then it became a standing arrangement where I would quietly transfer money into their account whenever things got tight, which seemed to be most of the time. I paid for Jake's middle school tuition at the private school Vivienne had decided was the only acceptable option. I paid for their older daughter's braces. When Marcus's car broke down, I bought him a replacement, not a new one, but a reliable one, the kind you could count on. When Vivian decided the kitchen needed to be redone, she presented it to me with contractor quotes already printed out, as if the conversation about whether I was willing to pay had already happened without me. I paid for that too. Over those 8 years, I had given my son and his family somewhere in the range of $90,000. I am not saying that number to be dramatic. I am saying it because it is accurate, and because it matters to what happened next. I want to be clear about something. I gave that money willingly. I never sat across the table from my son and felt like I was being held at gunpoint. What I felt, if I'm being honest with myself, was needed. I had lost his mother, my wife, Patricia, to cancer when Marcus was in his late 20s. And after that, I had thrown myself into being useful, being the steady one, being the one you could always call. It filled something in me that I didn't know how to fill any other way, and for a long time I told myself that was enough. But there were signs. There were always signs. 2 Christmases before the graduation, I had flown in to spend the holiday with them. I had bought gifts for all 4 of them, Marcus, Vivienne, Jake, and their daughter Sophie, and I had brought a bottle of wine that I knew Marcus liked. When I arrived, Vivienne said hello, and then went into the kitchen and did not come back out for the first hour I was there. At dinner, she made a comment about how I always seemed to know how to insert myself into things. Marcus laughed like it was a joke. Jake looked at his plate. That Christmas, I lay in their guest room and stared at the ceiling for an hour before I could fall asleep. There was also the birthday. 2 years before the graduation, Marcus turned 40. I had offered to take the whole family out to dinner at a restaurant of his choosing, anywhere in the city, my treat. He said that sounded great. 2 days before the dinner, he called and said that Vivienne's parents were also in town, and they were going to do a family dinner, just the 6 of them, and he'd call me soon to reschedule. I found out from Jake, who mentioned it accidentally in a phone call a few weeks later, that the dinner had actually included Vivienne's brother and his wife and their kids and a dozen other people from her side, just not me. I had filed that away in a drawer in my mind and closed it firmly shut. After the graduation call, I opened that drawer and I looked at everything in it. I sat in that chair by the window for a long time, long enough for the morning to turn into afternoon, long enough for the time of the party to come and go. At some point, I got up and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter and thought about Jake, and whether he actually knew, and whether it made any difference. 3 days passed before Marcus called again. When he did, his tone had shifted slightly. There was a thin veneer of conciliation over the same fundamental indifference he'd had in the first call. "So, about that dinner," he said. "Sure," I said. "Before we get to that, I want to ask you something." "Okay, does Jake know I wasn't at his party?" There was a pause. "He knows there was a scheduling conflict." "A scheduling conflict," I said. "Dad, I want to ask you something else. When I gave you and Vivienne money for the kitchen renovation 3 years ago, did she tell her parents that I had paid for it?" Another pause, longer this time. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I'm curious, because I've been thinking. I've given you a lot of support over the years, Marcus. Financially, I mean. And I've been happy to do it. But I'm starting to wonder if maybe that support has made things worse for everyone, not better. Maybe it's created a situation where the lines got blurry. I don't know what you're trying to say." "I'm not trying to say anything. I'm saying it directly. I've been paying for a lot of things for a lot of years, and it turns out I'm not welcome at my grandson's graduation party because my presence would make things complicated. I'm trying to understand how those 2 things fit together." His voice changed then. The veneer came off. "You know what? This is exactly what Vivienne was talking about. You always have to make things about money. You always have to remind us what you've done. It's exhausting, Dad. It makes people not want to be around you." I let that sit for a moment. "I'll be in touch," I said, and I hung up. "I want to tell you what happened next. But first I need to tell you about a phone call I made that same evening. I called my old friend Dennis, who had been my closest friend since college, and who I had not talked to as much as I should have in recent years. Dennis had retired a year before me and had moved to a small town in western Montana. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. All of it. The graduation party, the kitchen renovation, the 40 years of Christmas dinners I had imagined, and the handful of actual ones that had barely resembled what I had in my mind, the drawer I had kept all of it in, and what had happened when I finally opened it. Dennis listened. He had always been a good listener. "Via." When I finished, he said, "Ray, can I ask you something and you won't take it the wrong way?" "Go ahead." "When's the last time you did something just for yourself? Not for Marcus, not for Jake, not to be useful, just something you wanted to do." I thought about it for a long time. Long enough that Dennis said, "You still there?" And I said yes. "I honestly can't remember," I said. "That's what I thought," he said. "Come visit me. Come spend a week out here. The mountains are something else in June." I told him I'd think about it. But even as I said it, I felt something shifting somewhere in my chest. Something that had been locked in one position for a very long time and was just barely beginning to move. The next morning, I drove to my financial advisor's office. His name is Gerald, and he has been handling my accounts for 15 years, and he is the kind of man who does not react to anything with visible emotion, which is exactly what I needed that day. I sat down across from him and I laid it all out. "I want to review everything," I said. "Every transfer I've made to Marcus's accounts over the past 8 years. Every tuition payment, every renovation payment, all of it." Gerald pulled it up without comment. We sat there for 2 hours going through it. The total, when we added it up carefully, was 93,000 and change. It was the first time I had seen the number written down in one place. I had always known it was significant. Seeing it in a single column made it something else. "I also want to look at my will," I said. Gerald nodded and pulled that up too. The will I had written after Patricia died left almost everything to Marcus. The house, the investment accounts, the land parcel I owned outside the city, a 12-acre piece of property that my father had left me and that I had held on to for 30 years. It was worth considerably more now than it had been when I inherited it. I had always imagined it passing to Marcus, and eventually to Jake and Sophie. I read through it slowly. "I'd like to make some changes," I said. Gerald did not raise an eyebrow. We spent another hour on that. When I left his office, it was almost noon, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only happens in late spring. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes. Then I took out my phone and called Jake. He picked up after a few rings. His voice had that slightly guarded quality teenagers get when they know a conversation might be complicated. "Hey, Grandpa." "Hey, buddy. I wanted to congratulate you. Graduating with honors is a big deal. I'm proud of you." There was a pause. "Thanks." Then, quieter. "I'm sorry about the party." So he did know. I had suspected as much. "You don't have anything to be sorry about," I said. "I mean that. None of that is on you. It wasn't my idea. I want you to know that." "I know that, Jake?" "I do." We talked for a while about his plans for college, which he was starting in the fall. He was going into pre-med. He had always been the kind of kid who knew what he wanted, and that had always made me proud. I told him that whatever happened between the adults in his family was between the adults, and that my relationship with him was its own separate thing, and that wasn't going to change. After we hung up, I sat there for a little while longer. Then I pulled out of the parking lot and drove home. 3 days after my meeting with Gerald, I received a text from Marcus. He had clearly talked to Vivienne, and the two of them had clearly concluded that some degree of fence mending was in order. The text was pleasant, in a strained, performing pleasantness kind of way. It asked how I was doing, and suggested that the four of us, me, him, Vivienne, and Jake, have dinner that Friday. I read the text. Then I put the phone in my pocket and went for a walk. During that walk, I did a lot of thinking. I thought about what Dennis had asked me. I thought about the drawer and everything in it. I thought about Patricia and what she would have said to me if she were sitting next to me right now. Patricia had been direct in a way I had never quite managed to be. She did not have patience for self-deception, including her own. She would have said something that would have stung a little, but would have been exactly right. She would have told me that I had been paying for a relationship that didn't actually exist, and that the moment I stopped paying would be the moment I found out what was really there underneath. I think I had known that for a while. I just hadn't been ready to look at it. When I got home from the walk, I typed out a response to Marcus. I told him dinner that Friday didn't work for me. I told him that I had been doing some thinking and that I wanted to give us both a little space before we sat down together. I told him I would be in touch. His response came back within 2 minutes. "What does space mean? What are you talking about?" I didn't respond. What happened in the following week happened quietly and without any theatrics, because that is how I have always preferred to operate. I am not the kind of person who makes speeches. I am the kind of person who makes decisions and then acts on them. I called the bank, and I put a stop on the standing transfer I had set up 5 years earlier that sent $300 a month to Marcus's household account. It was a small amount in isolation, but it had been running long enough that it had become invisible, the kind of thing that nobody notices until it stops. I also reviewed the documentation for the kitchen renovation. As I had suspected, The arrangement had been set up such that the contractor invoices had been sent directly to me, and I had paid them from my account. There was no ownership transfer, no formal agreement. I had simply paid for improvements to a house I did not own and received nothing in return. That was not something I could undo, but it was useful information. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Carol, and she has an office about 20 minutes from my house. I had used her for estate planning after Patricia died, and she remembered me. I laid out the situation as plainly as I could, and she listened carefully. "Tell me about the land parcel," she said. I told her. 12 acres, outside the city, inherited from my father, held in my name alone. Marcus had mentioned it over the years in that casual, proprietary way that had always bothered me without my fully acknowledging why. He had once referred to it as eventually coming to him in a conversation with Vivienne that I had overheard, not asked about, not thanked for, coming to him as if it were already his. Carol had some questions. I had some answers. We talked for about an hour. When I left her office, I drove past the neighborhood where Marcus and Vivienne lived. I didn't stop. I just drove past and looked at the house for a moment. The house with the renovated kitchen, the house I had helped hold together for the better part of a decade. Then I drove home. Marcus called the next morning. His voice was different from any of the versions I had heard before. Tighter, more controlled, but with something running underneath it like a current. "I got an alert from the bank," he said. "The transfer stopped." "I know," I said. "What's going on?" "Did something happen with your accounts?" "Nothing happened with my accounts. I stopped the transfer." Silence. "Why?" "Because I've been thinking about what you said, about how reminding people what I've done makes them not want to be around me. I thought about that a lot, actually, and I decided that if that's how things feel, maybe it's better for everyone if I stop doing the things so there's nothing to be reminded of." "Dad, I didn't mean." "I know you didn't mean it as a policy statement, but I've been thinking about it as one. I'm 64 years old, Marcus. I'm not in bad health, but I'm not going to live forever. And I've spent a lot of years being useful and not a lot of years being happy. I'm thinking about changing that balance." "What does that mean?" "I'm going to go visit Dennis for a few weeks, out in Montana. And while I'm out there, I'm going to think about some things. When I get back, maybe we can have that dinner." There was a long pause. "What about the will?" he said. I was not surprised by the question. I was surprised by how quickly it came. "What about it?" I said. "You said you were meeting with Gerald, and then with Carol. I want to understand where things stand." "I've made some adjustments," I said. "That's probably all I should say right now." "What adjustments?" "Marcus," I said, "I want you to think about the fact that that was your first question. Not 'How are you, Dad?' Not 'I'm sorry about what I said.' The first question was about the will." I paused. "I'll call you when I get back from Montana." I hung up before he could respond. I left for Montana 4 days later. I packed a bag, loaded up my car, and drove. I didn't fly because I didn't want to. I wanted the time. I wanted the hours of highway and the way the landscape changes as you move west. The flat certainty of the Midwest giving way to something rougher and more honest. I stopped in Billings and got a good meal at a diner where no one knew my name. I drove through a stretch of country that was so wide and open it made something in me go quiet. Dennis met me at the door of his place when I pulled up on the afternoon of my third day on the road. He looked essentially the same as he had the last time I'd seen him, maybe 2 years ago. A little more gray. The same ease in how he stood. "You made it," he said. "I made it," I said. He had coffee ready, and we sat on the porch, and I didn't say much for the first hour. I didn't need to. That had always been the thing about Dennis. The silences with him were never uncomfortable. They were just space. Eventually he asked how things were going, and I told him what I had done over the past few weeks. The bank transfer, the meeting with Carol, the will, the drive out here. He nodded slowly. "How does it feel?" I thought about it. "Like setting down something heavy," I said. "But also like I'm not sure what to do with my hands now that they're empty." He laughed. "Yeah, that's about right." I stayed with Dennis for 9 days. We hiked. We fished, badly, in a way that was less about catching fish and more about standing in cold water and not talking. We drove into town a few evenings and had dinner and talked the way we used to talk when we were younger about everything and nothing, looping back through old memories and forward into what was still left to figure out. On my 5th day there, I got a call from Marcus. I let it go to voicemail. The message was longer than his usual ones, and the tone had shifted again. There was something more raw in it, less controlled. He said he wanted to talk. He said he had been thinking about what I'd said. He said Vivienne had some things she wanted to explain about the graduation situation. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I put the phone away and went back out onto the porch. On my 7th day in Montana, I got a call from my attorney, Carol. She told me that the paperwork I had asked her to prepare was ready for my signature when I returned. The land parcel, which had been listed in the will as passing to Marcus, had been redirected. Half of it was going into a trust for Jake and Sophie, accessible to them when they turned 25, with no strings attached, no parental involvement. The other half I had donated to a land conservation organization that my father had supported when he was alive. He had cared about that kind of thing, and so do I. Marcus was still in the will, but the number was substantially smaller than it had been. When Carol told me everything was in order, I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat on the porch and looked out at the mountains and felt, for the first time in what might have been years, like something in my life was actually mine. I want to tell you about the dinner when I got back. Marcus called me 2 days after I returned home, and this time I answered. His voice had changed again. There was something stripped down about it, something that almost resembled honesty. He asked if I would come to their house for dinner that Saturday. He said it would just be the 4 of us, and that there were things he needed to say. I told him I would come. Saturday came, and I drove over in the early evening. The house looked the same from the outside. The renovated kitchen was visible through the window as I walked up the front path. Vivienne opened the door. She said hello and met my eyes for a moment, something she did not often do, and then stepped back to let me in. Jake was in the living room and stood up when I came in and hugged me, which he hadn't done in a while. Sophie, who was 15 and generally more interested in her phone than in family dynamics, actually came out and said hello. We sat down to dinner, and for the first 10 minutes or so, nobody said anything that mattered. Marcus asked about Montana. I told him about the hiking and the fishing. He nodded. Then Vivienne set down her fork and said, "I owe you an apology, Raymond." I waited. The graduation party. That was wrong. I was trying to manage too many things at once, and I didn't think about how it would feel to you. That was a mistake. I looked at her, and I thought about whether I believed her. I thought about the drawer and everything in it. I thought about the $40,000 I had given them over the past 3 years alone, and whether this apology would have arrived without the bank transfer stopping and the will being revised. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. Marcus cleared his throat. "I also said something unfair, about how you make people not want to be around you. That wasn't right. I was frustrated and I said something I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." I nodded. "Thank you." There was a beat of silence. "I want to be honest with you both about something," I said, "and I want you to let me finish before you respond." They both nodded. "I have given this family a lot of money over a lot of years. I have never once regretted giving it, because I love my son and I love my grandchildren. But somewhere along the way, the giving became invisible. It stopped being something you noticed and started being something you counted on. And I let that happen. That's on me as much as it's on anyone. But I can't keep doing it the same way and expect anything to be different." Marcus started to say something. I held up a hand. "I'm not done. I've made some changes to my estate plan. I want you to know that. I'm not going to go through all the details tonight, but I want to be transparent that things have changed. Not as a punishment. As a correction. Jake and Sophie still have something substantial coming to them when they're older. That hasn't changed." I looked at Marcus. "What I hope is that we can figure out how to have a real relationship, not a financial arrangement. A relationship." The table was very quiet. It was Jake who spoke first. He was 18 and going to college in the fall, and he had his grandmother's eyes, Patricia's eyes. And in that moment, he reminded me of her so much, it was almost difficult to look at him. "I'd like that, Grandpa," he said. I looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," I said. "Me too, buddy." The dinner went another 2 hours. It was not a perfect evening. There were awkward moments, and there were things left unsaid that will probably remain unsaid for some time. Marcus and I did not resolve 40 years of complicated love in one Saturday dinner, and I would not have trusted it if we had. But something was different. Something felt like it was resting on actual ground instead of on a surface that I had been quietly propping up from underneath. When I got home that night, I sat in the chair by the window, the same chair where I had sat the morning of the graduation party. The morning everything finally cracked open, and I thought about what came next. I had been thinking, during those 9 days in Montana, about a property I had seen listed online. It was a cabin in the hill country of central Texas, about 2 hours outside of Austin, on 4 acres, with a creek running along the back edge of the property. It was not expensive by any urban standard. It was exactly the kind of place I had imagined living in during some retirement that always seemed to be arriving later, and then later again, and then never. I pulled up the listing on my phone. In the following weeks, I sold my house. It went quickly, the market was good, and the house was in good shape, and I had taken care of it over the years the way I take care of most things. I took the proceeds and paid cash for the cabin in Texas. I kept enough liquid to live on comfortably without touching my investment accounts. I donated a portion to a scholarship fund at the university Marcus had attended in Patricia's name, which felt right. I drove to Texas in July with my car packed and a new dog in the passenger seat, a 3-year-old shepherd mix named Walt that I had adopted from a rescue organization a few weeks earlier. He was large and gray-muzzled and completely unimpressed with traffic and deeply interested in everything outside the window, and he was exactly the right companion for that drive. The cabin was smaller than my house had been. The kitchen was modest. The porch was long and faced west, and in the evenings the light came across the hill country in a way that made everything look like it had been reconsidered and approved. I called Dennis from the porch on my first night there. "I did it," I said. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting for this call." Marcus called me the following week. He sounded slightly off balance by the news of the house sale, by the Texas cabin, by the idea of me somewhere else entirely, somewhere that was mine in a way nothing had quite been mine before. I think he had expected some version of things to go back to normal, and I think he was beginning to understand that the version of normal that had existed before was not coming back. We talked for about 20 minutes. It was a better conversation than most of the ones we'd had in recent years. He asked about the cabin. I told him about the creek and the hill country light and Walt, who at that moment was sprawled across my feet. He laughed a little at the dog. "You should bring Jake down sometime," I said, "before he starts school. There's a lake about 40 minutes from here. Good fishing." A pause. "Yeah," Marcus said. "He'd like that." "So would I," I said. That was true. I meant it. I am not going to tell you that everything became simple after that. Life is not organized that way. Marcus and I are still figuring out what we are to each other now that the financial scaffolding is gone, and there are conversations ahead of us that won't be easy. Vivian and I will probably never be close, and I have arrived at a kind of peace with that. Some things are not fixable, and forcing them is worse than accepting them. What I can tell you is that in the evenings, when the light comes across the hills, and Walt has settled down at my feet, and the creek is doing what it does in the distance, I feel something that I don't know, that I've earned the word for, but I'm going to use it anyway. I feel like I am finally where I am supposed to be. Not because everything worked out, not because the people I love turned into different people overnight, but because somewhere in the middle of being told I was too much, I found out that the right answer was not to make myself smaller. The right answer was to find the place where I fit exactly as I am. Jake called me last Sunday. He was getting settled into his dorm room and he wanted to talk. We were on the phone for almost an hour. He told me about his roommate and his first week of classes and the professor in his intro biology course, who he already likes. He asked me about the cabin and whether Walt had figured out the creek yet. I told him Walt had. In fact, discovered the creek on day 2 and had opinions about it that he expressed at length. Jake laughed. It was the kind of laugh that sounds easy and real, the kind that doesn't cost anything. I sat on the porch and listened to it and thought about Patricia, who would have found this whole story either deeply vindicating or deeply exhausting, and probably both. I thought about my father and the land I had given back to the earth in his name. I thought about all the years I had spent being useful, and the strange new feeling of being something else, something harder to name, less legible to other people, but entirely my own. The evening light came across the hills. Walt looked up at me. I told Jake I'd talk to him next week, and I meant it.